Hello and welcome to The Faerie Folk, the podcast that takes you on a magical tour to discover the myth and the magic of the United Kingdom without leaving the comfort of your own home. I hope you're all doing well and are ready for another adventure. Today's destination is London, the capital city of England, famous for its rich and diverse history, home to landmarks such as Big Ben, the London Eye, and the Tower of London. Many of England's most famous moments have played out right here in the city, and it's also the backdrop of many of our favourite works of fiction too. It's hard to think of London without imagining the Victorian streets where Sherlock Holmes solved his cases, or the nursery window where Peter Pan and Wendy first met. London has also been home to many famous people, past and present, and a long line of historic kings and queens. But the city also has its darker side, and is known as the hunting ground of one of the most famous serial killers of all time, Jack the Ripper. So there's no wonder that London is full of many haunted locations, strange apparitions, and supernatural tales. In this episode, we will be looking at two chilling London legends, one Victorian vision from the 1800s, and one more recent supernatural occurrence from the 1970s. So hop on board a double-decker bus, or grab the next underground train, and let's travel together into the heart of the city. Welcome to London's West End, the city's famous theatre district. You might be familiar with the dazzling row of theatres that line Shaftesbury Avenue, leading towards the famous Eros statue, which, fun fact, is actually of Antiros, Eros' twin brother. But that's not where we're stopping today. We must travel on through the bustling Leicester Square that's known for its large cinemas and lavish film premieres, and then down onto the Strand, where you can find a few more West End theatres, the Savoy, the Vaudeville, and our destination for the day, the Adelphi Theatre. Originally built in 1806, the Adelphi is a beautifully large theatre. Inside, its walls are adorned in red and gold, with matching seats, from which you can look onto its grand stage. Perhaps you've already visited this theatre and have seen one of the many plays and musicals that have been performed here over the years, such as Waitress, One Man, Two Guvnors, and Sweeney Todd. But let me take you on a slight detour now. If we turn to the right and travel a little further down the Strand, we come to this. A hidden archway that leads us down into Bull Inn Court, through the narrow street, past the pub, and into Maiden Lane. This is where you can find the theatre's stage door, where perhaps you might wait around to get a glimpse of one of your favourite actors, or perhaps where you might gather to hear the story of one of Theatreland's most famous ghosts. Back in the late 1800s, there was a famous actor who went by the stage name William Terriss. After a series of interesting jobs in silver mining and sheep farming amongst others, Terriss finally found his home on the London stage. Delighting audiences with his deep voice and dashing good looks, Terriss quickly became one of England's most famous actors, taking on iconic theatrical roles such as Robin Hood, the tragic hero in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and the famous Tudor King in Henry VIII. But off the stage, Terriss was known for his kind and gentle nature. It's said that a fellow actor once remarked, "Is it raining, Terriss?" when he arrived at the theatre soaking wet, only for him to reveal that he had actually just rescued a child from drowning in the River Thames. Terriss continued his success into his later years and was a constant popular and well-loved figure of the London stage. He began to help out a young up-and-coming actor, Richard Archer Prince, who was hoping to increase his profile and land some of the West End's more glamorous roles. But Prince was an alcoholic and sunk further and further into his toxic pastime. After being seen at the Adelphi arguing with Terriss and unable to get money from the Actors' Benevolent Fund, fed up, drunk and enraged, Prince headed to the Adelphi. Terriss was also en route to the theatre for that evening's performance of Secret Service, taking the route down the dark, concealed arch of Bull Inn Court. But there he was accosted by Prince, who stabbed him twice and then tried to flee. Terriss sank to the floor, and desperately attended to by fellow actors, he died. His last words were said to be the rather chilling, "I will come back." And come back he did. Terriss's ghost is now an infamous one that has been seen in many locations across London. His most frequent haunt is of course the theatre in which he played his final performance, here at the Adelphi. You might catch a glimpse of him pacing up and down beside the stage door, in his top hat and coat, or roaming in the theatre's wings or auditorium. But it's said you're most likely to spot Terriss's ghost in his old dressing room. Strange knocks on the door, furniture being rearranged overnight, and even a sofa bouncing on its own, are all strange activities that have been attributed to Terriss's ghost over the years. He's said to have been a rather active apparition, turning lights on and off and affecting the temperature. And it seems as though it's not just the theatre itself that has been subject to his supernatural theatrics either. If you take the tube to Covent Garden Station, you might just catch a ghastly glimpse of Terriss's ghost. Although the station was yet to be built when the actor was alive, he was said to have favoured the area for buying baked goods. And so, since then, Terriss's ghost has been heard walking around the area, startling unsuspecting underground workers. It was thought that his last dramatic sighting was in 1972, and the 2005 documentary Ghosts on the Underground gave a detailed and spine-chilling account of this final encounter with Terriss. A man named Christopher Joseph Clifford worked at the station as a lift operator. He had emptied the lift for the final time as the station was closing up for the night. Having turned to put on his portable radio, he then turned back to see a tall figure dressed in old-fashioned attire, complete with a top hat. Clifford apologised to the man for locking him in, but when he went to get his keys to let him out, the man was already gone. Clifford searched the platform for the man, but there was no sign of him. It wasn't until later, when he was shown a photograph of a man, he immediately recognised him as the same man he had seen at the station. It was a photograph of Terriss, who by then had been dead for 75 years. It's claimed that as the city becomes busier, Terriss's ghost has shied away. Whether or not he'll be spotted again remains to be seen. But the next time you pass by Maiden Lane, take a minute to stop and look around, for you might see the blue plaque fixed to the wall with a rather ominous description. William Terriss, 1847 to 1897, hero of the Adelphi melodrama, met his untimely end outside this theatre. So that was the story of the Adelphi Theatre apparition. The information for today's tale was compiled from the book Murder Houses of London by Jan Bonderson and also Haunted Theatres by Tom Ogden, which both lay out a very interesting timeline of Terriss's life, as well as his later ghostly appearances. And the famous Ghosts on the Underground documentary was another valuable source that I remember absolutely chilling me to the bone the first time I watched it. I very much recommend it, but I suggest not making the same mistake I did a few years ago and watching it right before you go to bed. It seems that Terriss's ghost was quite active in the early 1900s, but has now potentially disappeared for good, with no proper explanation of what might have driven him away. Although, of course, as some may remind you, there's no proper explanation for the apparition's existence in the first place. Many people pass by the Adelphi Theatre without knowing the history of the man that was murdered there, and I too discovered this story only after I happened to stumble across the plaque whilst passing by the theatre one afternoon. I was intrigued by the dramatic description of Terriss meeting an untimely end, and had to find out more. Haunted or not, these ghost stories have helped to keep the memory alive of one of England's great actors, and who knows, perhaps one day the Adelphi apparition might return. When I'm not travelling to mystical locations or researching myths and legends, it's likely that you'll find me in a theatre somewhere. I love watching live performances, and so it was very interesting to find a fascinating crossover of two of my passions. Sadly, I have not yet caught a glimpse of the ghost, but that just gives me another excuse to visit the theatre. It's a tragedy that Terriss died in the way that he did, but perhaps without the notoriety of his spectre, modern audiences might never have learnt of William Terriss and his interesting life. On your next visit to the city, why not take a detour to the Adelphi? You can easily take an underground train to either Charing Cross or Embankment, and then it's just a short walk from there to the theatre. See a show if you can, but always remember to keep an eye out for any phantom performers drifting off into the wings. Now our next tale takes us a little further forward in time, to London in the 1970s, when Terriss's ghost was spotted for the final time, and bell-bottoms were in, the Bee Gees were on the radio, and a vampire was on the loose. And so we travelled to Highgate, a wealthy area in the north of London. Highgate still feels like the small village it once was, the perfect place to get lost in one of the many parks or green spaces that surround the area. In Highgate Village, you can leisurely browse the shops, whilst you gaze at some of the lovely Georgian architecture that you might pass on your way. But we'll save the sightseeing for later, because right now, it's time to discover our next legend. So let's climb uphill to Swains Lane and onwards towards the iron gates of the magnificent Highgate Cemetery. Highgate Cemetery is a large Victorian burial ground that was built as part of a wider project in the 1900s to deal with the overcrowding problem in some of London's more central graveyards. Previously, people buried their dead in parish churches, but after centuries of interments, these smaller plots of lands were starting to get full. This was back when cremation was still frowned upon, so coffins and bodies were literally piled upon one another. To combat this problem, 7 cemeteries, known as the Magnificent Seven, sprung up across London, in the hope of alleviating the number of burials taking place in the overcrowded spaces in the city centre. One of those is Brompton Cemetery, where the actor William Terriss is buried. But the most famous of these 7 cemeteries is Highgate, full of towering trees, natural fauna and flora, and beautiful Victorian mausoleums and tombstones, and one of my absolute favourite places to visit in London. By the 1600s, the cemetery was struggling financially and fell into disrepair. Once a beautiful park-like ground that Victorian families strolled around and sometimes even picnicked in, the cemetery was now overgrown and locked up. And that was when the sightings began. There was talk of a spectral man in a hat who had been seen disappearing through a wall, and dead animals were said to have turned up completely drained of blood. These rumours spread, and eventually, in 1969, a man named David Farrant decided to spend a night in the then closed cemetery. He claimed to have spotted a tall, inhuman figure on his cemetery stakeout and became curious as to whether anyone else had spotted the paranormal phenomenon. And so he wrote to the Hampstead and Highgate Express, and in an article published on the 6th of February 1970, he asked if anyone else had seen the strange figure. There were several responses. Some had seen a spectral cyclist, others a woman in white, but all were sighted in and around the cemetery and Swains Lane beside it, along with the tall man in the hat that Farrant himself had seen. But this was when another man threw his hat into the supernatural ring, Sean Manchester. And on the 27th of February 1970, the infamous article was published, "Does a Vampire, spelt Wampyr, walk in Highgate?" The article detailed how Manchester had carried out extensive research and investigation into the Highgate phenomenon. Up until now, the creature had been thought of as a ghost-like spectre or paranormal phenomena, but it was Manchester's theory that solidified the creature's more infamous guise as a vampire. Manchester proposed the theory that a king vampire of the undead had been brought to England in a coffin from somewhere near Turkey in the 19th century. The vampire lived out a presumably rather lavish life in London's West End before passing away and being buried in Highgate Cemetery. But Manchester believed that Satanists were now planning on resurrecting the Vampire King. He made his intentions clear that the only way to rid the cemetery of the creature would be to exorcise it by the traditional and approved manner, by which he meant staking it and chopping off its head. It's hard to ignore the parallels between this vampire story and the eponymous character of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but Manchester commented on that too, claiming that Stoker's novel was actually based on fact. The Hampstead and Highgate Express continued to publish articles on the topic, and March the 6th, Why Do the Foxes Die?, also brought to light more of the theories. Reporters spoke once again to Farrant, who claimed he had found a dead fox the previous weekend, and that it, along with other dead animals he had claimed to have found in the cemetery, had no visible signs for how it had died. Farrant and Manchester met in the cemetery to discuss their individual sightings. But it was clear that Farrant believed that it was a paranormal presence that haunted the cemetery, but Manchester was the one who insisted that it was a vampire that stalked the grounds, draining animals of blood. This led to a mob of vampire hunters eventually descending on the cemetery on Friday the 13th. From then on, Farrant and Manchester would become rivals, each of them battling to be the first to find and then slay the vampire, or at least to find some proof of supernatural activity. A charred and headless body was reportedly found in the cemetery sometime after this incident, inferring that someone had apparently slain what they thought was the vampire. In the years to come, the two men would remain rivals and even threatened one another with a magician's duel in 1973 that never actually came to fruition, and Farrant was arrested the year after for grave desecration. People would continue to report sightings of unusual phenomena in the cemetery, but whether or not the king vampire still stalks the grounds is up for debate. Farrant sadly passed away in 2019, but up until his death he remained a passionate surveyor of the occult and the paranormal. He would often remind people that he did not believe in vampires, despite his name forever being entangled with the Highgate case. He also always refuted the claims of grave desecration upon which he was arrested. Sean Manchester, on the other hand, published a book on the Highgate vampire in 1985, and following that, several other similarly themed works. He remains certain that the infamous vampire was slain in the 1970s, and so far no other vampiric reports threaten the cemetery. To this day, he continues his work as a bishop, exorcist, author, and is also involved in several other creative outputs. And so that was, in a nutshell, the story of the Highgate vampire. My account is compiled from information in The Law of the Land by Westwood and Simpson, as well as parts from Merlin Coverley's Occult London and Francesco Garcia's Vice article on the topic. You can easily find Hampstead and Highgate's original articles from the 70s online too. All are very interesting reads and really helped paint a picture of these events in chronological order. And I must also mention the darkly gripping Necropolis, London and its Dead by Catherine Arnold, which taught me all I could ever want to know about London's cemeteries, graveyards and burials. So far, no tangible evidence has been found to prove that a vampire once walked in Highgate, save from the claims of Farrant and Manchester themselves. It's interesting to note how the vampire's descriptions varied over time, as earlier sightings were inconsistent and seemed more reminiscent of a traditional ghost sighting rather than the vampire that the legend ended up focusing on. The 60s and 70s were in the middle of the heyday of the Hammer horror films, in particular their long run of Dracula-centered storylines, which brought the character and vampire folklore in general back into popular media. Farrant and Manchester were very involved with the press themselves, and it seems that they perhaps enjoyed the wave of notoriety that came with their vampire-slaying reputation. Could they both have fabricated all or part of the tale to create their own fantasy story, following the footsteps of Stoker's Van Helsing character? Or were they pioneers, the only ones brave enough to bring to light the truth about the inhuman creature living within the cemetery walls? I'll leave you to make your mind up on that one, and decide whether a vampire really stalked the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. I've always been interested in this case, as there aren't a huge number of contemporary vampire sightings in the United Kingdom, so this one always stood out as being something different. But it's hard not to see the parallels here between the Highgate vampire and the story of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The ongoing rivalry between the two men involved has certainly seemed to eclipse the story of the vampire itself, turning this tale less into one of paranormal mystery and more into one about 1970s attitudes towards the occult, the media's ability to embellish and publicise, and indeed the lifelong feud between two men with very different beliefs. Highgate really is a beautiful part of London, and if you ever get the chance to visit, I'd certainly recommend you take a trip to Old Swains Lane to see the spots where the vampire was first sighted. For a small donation, you can also roam freely in the east side of the cemetery itself, or take the fascinating guided tour of the west, where you'll be led around the winding path of the cemetery, with a knowledgeable guide on hand ready to retell the history of those buried there. I've been lucky enough to take several cemetery tours myself, and I definitely recommend giving it a go if you haven't before. But if you do visit the cemetery, please remember that it is an active burial ground and a place for historical conservation and remembrance. The cemetery officials naturally wish to distance themselves from the Highgate vampire story, so it might be wise to leave the steaks and garlic at home, as they don't take too kindly to trespassing vampire hunters these days. If you ever manage to get out there and take the tour, let us know and show us your photos on Twitter and Instagram at @thefaerie_folk. We've also just recently started a Facebook, so feel free to join us there if that's more your thing. And don't forget, it's Faerie spelled Faerie. Okay then, well, I suppose it's just about time to say goodbye to London and its spectres for a while. But don't worry, there are enough ghouls and ghosts hiding out here to entice us back for another visit someday. I'll see you next month for another magical journey, but for now, stay safe, stay curious, and I look forward to sharing more myths and magic with you next time. Goodbye! The music featured in today's episode was Galway from Incompetech by Kevin MacLeod. Sound effects were from freesounds.org.